Test 1, 2, test 1, 2, check, check.
Hello, welcome to this seminar on NATO 2030 reflection process and the new strategic concept. And welcome to our panelists from Berlin, London, Washington and Oslo. And welcome to all the viewers. It's great to have you all on board. My name is Johannes Rø and I'm a researcher at the Norwegian Institute for Defence Studies. And I'm the one welcoming you here today because I've headed the Security in Northern Europe program for the last couple of years. And this seminar presents some of the fruits of our recent collaboration. Originally, this seminar was planned as a physical event in Oslo, but due to the pandemic, a digital seminar remained the only viable option. All participants are therefore scattered around a little bit. Some even have the virus, so they have a good excuse if they tumble. And unfortunately, State Secretary Bent-Joacim Bentzen could not make it today, so we'll hear from him in a pre-recorded tape. Before we start, I should remind everyone that the seminar will be streamed and recorded, even the Q&A session. And the entire event will be available on our YouTube channel after the event. I should also mention that a new compilation of text will be published in connection with this seminar. Our partner DGAP is responsible for the publication, but all SNI partners contribute. We'll forward the link to the chat as soon as it's available. So, this seminar actually marks the end of the SNI program in this configuration. As many of you will know, the SNI program has been running for almost a decade now. It's been sponsored by the Norwegian Ministry of Defence, a support we've been very grateful for. And the profile and scope of the program has always been international. In the latest program period, DGAP from Berlin, RUSI from London, and CSIS from Washington have been partners. And this, I think, is the perfect occasion to cover these three institutions in a little bit of glory. They deserve that. We're very, very grateful for your contributions over the years, so thanks a lot. And if you forgive me for bragging a little bit, our efforts have been sort of an intellectual track to diplomacy between countries that all have a stake in Northern European affairs. Often when we talk of the importance of dialogue, we have discussions with our opponents in mind. But dialogue among allies is no less important. And over the years, the SNI program has been an important platform for dialogue between politicians, think tankers, academics, defense intellectuals, and bureaucrats. We have exchanged ideas, discussed challenges, disagreed sometimes, and sought solutions. Different formats have been utilized. We've had public conferences like this one. We've prepared plenty of closed meetings in all 4 capitals, and often provided a podium for government officials. And today's keynote is a case in point. Although I'm obviously slightly biased here, I believe that the security dialogue in all partner capitals has been better as a result. So, as is indicated in the invitation, the formula of the SNI program has been to zoom in on topical issues pertaining to Northern European security. The partners have always provided national angles on common challenges. And that's what we're about to do today as well. Soon, we'll hear remarks from 4 capitals reflecting on the ongoing strategy processes in NATO. But before we move on and hear Secretary Bentzen speak, let me just try to connect today's topic with the issue that is on everyone's mind right now. Because while Ukraine is not Northern Europe, the ripple effects are systemic. No part of Europe is unaffected when Russia is in a war mode. Last Wednesday, in Aftenposten, a Norwegian newspaper, our defense minister Enoksen raised the prospect that Russia might activate its bastion defense. That would be very dramatic in Northern Europe. But if the crisis evolves, it's probably more likely that Russia will unleash many of the hybrid instruments in its catalogue below the threshold of Article 5. But still, the effects can be very disruptive all across Europe. What's immediately at stake, obviously, is the political autonomy of Ukraine. Deployment patterns both in Russia and Belarus indicate that the prospects of war are real, and Russia's demands presented to NATO are too radical to be constructive. And very predictably, diplomacy has so far yielded very little. As a matter of fact, the SNI program has grappled with this issue before. Back in March 2015, we had a conference called Northern European Security in Light of the Ukraine Conflict. The then Norwegian Defence Minister, Ine Marie Eriksen Søreide, presented her view to us back then. She said that Russia can only rebuild trust by changing its course and respecting international law and the UN Charter. That has not happened. Rather, Moscow now appears more prepared to use the threat of force in its attempt at denying Ukraine the chance to orient itself towards NATO and the EU. And this situation is delicate for NATO, of course, especially at the time when the alliance is about to rewrite its strategic concept. It's delicate because NATO's present concept implies a dual commitment that is very difficult to reconcile. On the one hand, NATO's first core task is about collective defense and the fundamental commitment to the security of its members, and its members only. In a very important sense, NATO is a closed community, and membership makes all the difference. The increased military readiness we now see in Eastern Europe falls squarely on this commitment and signals NATO's resolve regarding its collective defense and its first core task. On the other hand, NATO is also committed to the liberal ideas of the Atlantic Charter. NATO's third core task, the so-called open door policy, is a symbol of that liberal hospitality. We all remember the Bucharest summit back in 2008, when the declaration said that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. Backing down from that pledge now will be taken as a broken promise. Even a prolonged moratorium on membership for those two states would be seen as a reward to Russia. So while NATO fulfills its first core task, the alliance clearly struggles to make good on its open door policy. While NATO countries seem prepared to impose economic sanctions, provide Ukraine with diplomatic support, and in some cases even arms, we're not willing to extend security guarantees. Consequently, NATO's open door policy is of limited help to Ukraine right now, and there's a real risk that Ukraine will be absorbed within a Russian sphere of influence. NATO, on its part, rejects the notion of spheres of influences because we do not consider that a legitimate ordering mechanism in international politics. It defies our liberal principles. States are supposed to be free to determine their own destiny. That attitude sets us apart from Russia. Still, NATO carries with it a historical experience where spheres of influences undeniably have been a fact of life. I suppose the lessons of Yalta still lingers, even though they're not easily admitted. The promise of the Soviet Union then to give Western countries some influence in Eastern Europe was compromised by the presence of the Red Army in those countries. The Yalta Agreement clearly did not correspond to the situation of facts, and Western leverage was undermined as a result. Today's situation is very different, obviously, but still it has some similar traits. As I interpret Secretary General Stoltenberg, NATO pursues 4 policy objectives simultaneously regarding Ukraine. NATO wants to avoid war. NATO is committed to the security of its members. The open door policy is still alive, and spheres of influences are rejected. Those objectives seem very difficult to reconcile, and yet they go to the heart of the discussions about how a new strategic concept should look like and what NATO's core task should be. I'm sure we'll come back to this later. Well, much more could be said, but it's about time to hear from Norwegian State Secretary of Defence, Bent-Joacim Bentzen. He is, as most of you know, part of the coalition government of the Social Democratic and Centre parties that was installed in Norway in October this fall. He'll provide us with an overview of how the Norwegian government currently views the state of affairs and what the kind of mindset that would be required in the years ahead. His remarks, I think, will serve as a perfect backdrop to the following discussion on the strategy processes in NATO. So thank you for the attention and welcome to this final SNI seminar. And I think it's time to plug in the State Secretary Bentzen. Thank you so far.
Thank you for your invitation to hold this keynote address. Security in Northern Europe is not only an academic pursuit with MOD funding. The challenges are real. The research and outreach program have contributed to public debate and informed government deliberations. As we face unprecedented challenges, the awareness that we all have a stake and share an interest in Northern European security is undeniable. We are now entering the third year with the coronavirus. Although the pandemic still has our full attention, we now have more insight than when the virus made its dramatic entrance. We have tested emergency preparedness systems. Cooperation across ministries with crisis management responsibilities have improved. We have gained valuable experience in balancing expert advice with political considerations. The total defense instruments have proved their value. Norway faces political, economic, technological, and military challenges. While the coronavirus challenges government finances, other areas are just as challenging. The security policy landscape has become more unpredictable. Global shifts in power, a rule-based international order under pressure, together with broader and more complex use of instruments of power, provides both enduring and new challenges. The risk of instability and conflict is on the rise. Hybrid threats and emerging and disruptive technologies in combination with and in the context of the threat of the use of conventional, irregular and nuclear military force are more prominent. International political tensions are rising and Norway has taken a stand. We have to ensure our choices make a difference. We must understand where we stand and what is going on in the world. To identify trends and patterns, we have to reveal and document friendly and adversary patterns of force development, operational design, and strategic intent. Let there be no doubt that it is Russia and China that lead the threats and challenges to the rule-based international order that we have come to rely on as the basis for peaceful relations between states. Russia poses a greater security challenge than it has for decades. Russia's new 10-year plan aims to further modernize and strengthen military power. This will have far-reaching regional and global implications we need to take seriously. That should guide our priorities and policy decisions. In addition, we must increasingly deal with China, a strong centralized state with authoritarian features which is gaining ground politically, economically, as well as militarily. The economic room for maneuver will be demanding in the years to come. Government expenditure will increase without revenues rising as much. The ongoing pandemic adds to the financial strains we are facing. We are in the midst of a rapid technological development, and the pace of the development is likely to increase in the years to come. With new technology, performance will increase, and the ability to weaponize new technology is a driver in the ongoing competition. We have experienced how governments exploit emerging and disruptive technologies to do harm below the threshold of armed conflict. The cyber attacks on the Norwegian Parliament is a prime example. Militarily, we encounter increased tension, resource constraints, and it is demanding to keep up with ongoing technological developments. The digitalization of our societies and armed forces converge with rapid technological change. Together, these developments highlight the importance of the increasing digital component of national security. We must ask ourselves how and to what extent new technologies affect the strategic importance of Norwegian territory in peace, crisis, and war. The choices we make must capture key features in the future security environment. We must encourage a mindset that allows for validating and challenging existing assumptions, decisions, estimates, probabilities, and risks. We must understand how our choices can best ensure Norway's security, safety, and freedom of action in the long term. We must have an idea of what is happening to those who matter the most to our own security, both today and in the years to come. Only when we grasp the interaction between their choices and ours, we can have an informed idea of what is wise to do. Understanding how competitors perceive one's possession of military power, operational design, use of military display, the use of military force, and how those perceptions may affect their behavior are key to designing and employing military power effectively. In the same way that Russian policy and practice affect Norwegian and Allied defense planning, one must think carefully about how we affect Russian thinking. If we become too forward-leaning, we may provoke Russian reactions without intending to. Dialogue with Russia is therefore important for a neighboring country such as Norway. Balancing deterrence is an important element in Norwegian strategic thinking and planning. The ability to handle the totality of challenges we face is about society's overall resilience and use of resources, and Norway's ability to withstand societal shocks. This is one of the reasons the government established a defense commission. The commissions will assess the civilian support of defense capabilities throughout the crisis and conflict spectrum, and what role the armed forces should play in supporting civilian organizations responsible for dealing with challenges below the threshold of armed conflict. The Commission will work closely with a parallel commission that will look into societal resilience. This applies in particular to issues related to hybrid threats and emerging and disruptive technologies and implication for the total defense instruments. When we know what is going on in the world, we can determine where we stand. We cannot assess Norway's defense capabilities in isolation, but compare against the capabilities of potential adversaries and the support we can expect or not from allies and partners. As a small state with limited resources, particular emphasis is on identifying vulnerabilities. It is important to identify both challenges and opportunities. The goal must be to strengthen Norway's overall defense capabilities as they develop in the years to come. We must include how we expect adversaries, as well as allies and partners, to develop within the same time frame. All actors seek to drive the competition in ways that favors them and disfavors their adversaries. The future is full of uncertainties. However, some aspects are more predictable, and good assessments and strategies take whatever advantage they can of this. We need strategic thinking that both take into account our best assessments of the competition we are involved in, now and in the future, and in some ways take into account the uncertainties of future developments. Climate change, for instance, is happening. It is imperative that we stand together fighting climate change. At the same time, we must investigate the strategic implications of climate change. How can improved Northern European practice help us approach the implications? What would the Russian bastion defense concept look like without the polar ice cap? How will an increase in commercial activities influence cooperation and strategic outlook in Northern Europe? How will climate change influence China's approach? What are the challenges and opportunities we should be aware of? Norwegian security is closely linked to NATO, allies and partners. In the years to come, it will be important to continue to nurture relations with the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany in particular. We have just come out of a 70-year-long era, during which the whole function of the military was to deter the other side. For deterrence purposes, the mere existence of an armed force is not sufficient. Deterrence is rather the result of the calculations and the reactions of competitors and potential adversaries. To deter credibly, peacetime planning, capability development, cooperation, exercising, and posturing is essential. To deter credibly, we have to make sure our choices matter. It is therefore important that we look outwards and forwards before we look inwards and land on concrete solutions. We are gravely concerned about Russia's large military buildup along the Ukrainian border. Russia is already able to conduct significant military operations against Ukraine and appears to be amassing a force capable of conducting a full-scale invasion. Despite recent high-level meetings, the buildup continues and Moscow's rhetoric has hardened over the past weeks. We must consider the possibility that Russia may be willing to accept the political, economic, and human cost of imposing its will. This underscores the importance of making the cost of military actions as clear to Russia as possible. We all face resource constraints that limit our choices. Competitors and potential adversaries also face these same constraints. Recognizing and identifying this is essential when devising cost-imposing strategies. Cost-imposing strategies can most fruitfully be pursued if we have an understanding of the constraints as well as ways to diminish them. These may include constraints within the defense sector as well as the trade-offs between defense and other forms of government spending. We are painfully aware of the limitations under which we labor, while we tend to discount the constraints that others face in pursuing their aims. Good strategies take advantage of them. Because of existing limitations, Norway must take greater responsibility for its own security, at the same time as we become more dependent on allies and partners. There is an urgent need to prioritize and optimize defense capabilities. New and strategic thinking is required, so that we can face the challenges and take advantage of the opportunities. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much. Thus far, we haven't actually gotten that much knowledge of the thinking of the new government. So from my point of view, that was a really interesting glimpse into the thinking of the new government. So here's the plan. We'll have a very short break now, and after the break, I'll give the word to Norway's most knowledgeable NATO scholar, Sigurd Hilde. Some of you might have said that the New York Times recently labeled the new US ambassador to NATO a NATO nerd, and Paul definitely falls in the same category. So he'll guide us through the presentations and the Q&A after that. But first, a very short break. Thanks for now. Hører vi deg, Pål?
Det satser på. Hører du meg? Jeg hører deg.
Veldig bra. Du er på. Ja, det var fint med en liten sånn... nå går det live. Det går live.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's time to start part 2 of this seminar today. My name, as Johannes mentioned before the break, is Paul Hilde, and I'm normally a colleague of Johannes and Robin, who will talk later at IFS. Now, just for some months, I'm working in the MOD to help out with some issues in the run-up to the Madrid summit. My main role as a moderator in this second part is to be intermediary between you, the audience, and the speakers who will now present some opening statements or views. And I really encourage everyone in the audience to ask questions. And I'm not going to tell you how you ask questions, so please pay attention. What you do is you open a web browser and go to slido.com. That's SLIDO.com. And near the top of the screen on the web page, you'll see a field where you can enter a number. And in that, there you go on the screen as well. And that number is 737735. So as in, think Boeing 737 and 735. You can also download an app on your mobile phone if you prefer to do it that way, or you don't have a computer in front of you. And it works the same there. You just download the app, open it, and then enter that number. And then you can just type in questions, and I'll see them here on my screen. To start off this discussion, there will be 4 speakers, and I won't spend time now by introducing them, and you can read more about them on the web page as an IFS web page at forsvaret.no. I'll just sort of mention their names. You can also see them at the top of the screen here. First out will be Rachel Ellehuus from CSIS in Washington, DC. Then Paul O'Neill from RUSI in London. Christian Mölling from DGAP in Berlin. And then Robin Alles from IFS in Oslo. And they'll be introducing their views of their capitals, i.e. this sort of the name of this part, which is capital letters. 10 minutes each, and then we'll have a short break, and then we'll go to your questions. I see I have already had the first question here, which is very good. I'll come back to that afterwards. So Rachel, if you want to start, please. Can you hear me in Washington?
Yes.
Excellent.
Good
Thank
morning.
you. It's all yours.
Good morning here. Good afternoon to everyone else. So nice to see everyone, and I really appreciate this idea of checking in and seeing what's going on in different capitals. I wanted to draw on something the State Secretary said, which was that good strategies take advantage of the strengths of allies and partners. And I'm a firm believer in that, and hopefully we can draw on some of that today and think through that. And certainly that is the view from Washington. We don't yet have a national security strategy or a national defense strategy on the street, but you can already see through speeches and interventions and some of the interim briefings on what that national security strategy might entail, that the view from Washington is in fact that allies and partners are a focus. And we're working in the current crisis with Russia and Ukraine in real time to project a joined up approach, whether that's on diplomacy or some of the economic measures that might follow, or in terms of deterrence and defense. I think we get a little bit of a hint of what might be ahead if we look at the Global Posture Review that was released earlier this year. I think in there, it is clear that for the United States, China is still a pacing challenge, but that Europe also remains a priority. And with regard to the Middle East and to some extent North Africa, that is an area where the United States is actually looking to do less. We haven't seen many moves out of the Middle East and North Africa yet, but there is an indication of the types of capabilities that might come back to the United States to reset readiness and create space for those other two problem sets. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But again, as I was preparing for this, I couldn't help but have this sense, we call it Groundhog Day. And in fact, this is coming up here on the 2nd of February, where you wake up and it seems like you've been in this day before. And for me, I feel like I've been in this day before, or this position before, because in 2011, Hillary Clinton gave a speech called The Pacific Century, where she talked about the need for the US to increase its focus on the Asia Pacific for economic, political, and even strategic military reasons. And then fast forward to 2014, when the US was writing its quadrennial defense review, there was a lot of language on China and the Indo-Pacific, and this rebalance was really the centerpiece of that quadrennial defense review. Well, that never really fully happened because as that quadrennial defense review was rolling off the presses, literally, Russia was invading Ukraine. And so we had a situation very much like today, where we're trying to make this strategic pivot or turn or rebalance our focus as real world events are playing out. And I also point out in that speech and that QDR, there were a lot of expectations that we would be drawing down from Iraq and Afghanistan. That also never happened as quickly as anticipated. So in effect, that rebalance was realized to some extent, but not really. And so if we think about the situation today and this focus on China as a pacing challenge, I think there'll be a lot of effort put towards thinking through how the US can continue to do both and. So both meet its responsibilities in Europe and affect this rebalance to the Asia Pacific. And for me, just sort of 3 quick points, and then I'll turn to the linkage with the NATO strategic concept and what we might be looking for there. I think inter-theater cooperation is going to be really important. We need to look back no further than the AUKUS debacle to realize that at times, those who are following Europe and transatlantic issues aren't necessarily talking with those or understanding those who are working Indo-Pacific focused issues. And in order to get this right, that has to improve. And we have to understand how we can be partners in both theaters. So for the US, as we go forward and try to do this both and to affect this inter-theater cooperation that I think will allow for the rebalance while ensuring there isn't much of a change in the US posture in Europe, the first thing I think we need to do is define the US essentials in Europe. We've done some work at CSIS looking at what European countries can and cannot do on their own, and it's pretty clear that Europe's really great at low-end crisis management, peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance, security assistance, training. Those are all things that have been done in an EU or NATO context, or even coalition of the willing, and those can continue without much US assistance. But in terms of high-end crisis management, collective defense, and cyber, these are the types of things where we need to double down and think through what we need from the US, particularly in a Northern European context. Secondly, I think and relatedly, let's determine where Europe might take the lead. We've already seen France and other countries stepping forward to take, to focus on North Africa in particular. And I like this term, which I think was coined by Anna Wieslander over in Sweden, our Atlantic Council colleague, of Europe as a first responder. When it's something that's in Europe or in Europe's immediate neighborhood, Europe needs to be the first responder in the event that the US can't or won't be there. And then finally, and I alluded to this before, making allies and partners part of the rebalance. NATO is in real time thinking through how the strategic concept will address China and China's behavior in Europe. But I don't expect, and we can have a discussion on this, that it will say much about what NATO as a whole should be doing in the Indo-Pacific. I think that falls to a subset of allies and partners. Quad partners first and foremost, working together with quad partners in Asia, and then countries like the UK and France, who really have national security interests in the region. And those countries, for example, have bases, they have access, they have partnerships that the US can leverage. So, the US can work with them to strengthen those regional partnerships and leverage them, and they can support a distributed force presence. The geography there is quite difficult. And so the more options we have for bases and ports and airspace, the better. And so I'd like to see more of that. To finish up, what is the overlap with NATO's strategic concept? I think I'll highlight 5 areas, which I think we'll pick up again on the discussion. The first is getting this balance right between conflict management and collective defense, because it's so easy when we, name NATO's 3 core tasks to, forget cooperative security and then sort of get the balance wrong between collective defense and conflict management. I know that now in post-Afghanistan, there's been a big question mark about whether NATO will go so far as to prioritize collective defense. To some extent, that's already happening. If you look at the NATO defense planning process and the types of things that countries are being asked to invest in. But, if you look at those capabilities, they are, I'm going to abuse the term here, dual use, but dual use in the sense, not civ-mil, but dual use in that they're both, many of them are relevant both to collective defense and crisis management. But we just have to be a little bit more careful about, defining the scope of crisis management, under what conditions and where might this happen. And I think a lot of countries are already doing this as a result of the drawdown in Afghanistan. They're thinking more deliberately about this. And I'd like to see a little bit more action in the South. I think France stepping forward to say that they would lead an enhanced forward presence in Romania is really helpful. The South is something, that relative to this region has not got a lot of attention. Secondly, I think we have some work to do on clarifying what we mean when we talk about hybrid and what our response might look like. We can see again in the current conflict that there are difficulties with attribution, thinking through what a proportional response might be for these actions that happen in that space. And going back to the US strategies, there is this focus on integrated deterrence, which we have had very little clarity of what exactly it means, but it's pretty clear that elements of that are, working with allies and partners in a cross-domain capacity and drawing on all these instruments of power. Insofar as this region really has got that nailed down, we can draw on lessons from you. Your state secretary talked about total defense concept or total defense approach and societal resilience. I think that's an area where you can teach NATO and the US in particular, how this works in this integrated deterrence construct. 3, getting EU defense right. This administration has been very forward-leaning in saying that they would like to see a European security and defense identity that is, more responsible and more capable. But how do we get that right? Just as NATO is trying to reinforce its own capabilities, there are issues with common funding in NATO, a need for more flexible decision-making. So I almost see a linkage between support for EU defense and support from EU member states who are members of the alliance in making these changes needed to make NATO more effective. 2 more quickly, getting the China language right. I said this before, but I do think that when I look at what's happening in Washington, there's a recognition that we need to be there in the current crisis with Russia and Ukraine and for our European allies. But, China is still, and the rebalance is still a core priority, bipartisan priority here in the US. So getting some language on that, I think, is going to be something the US is looking for. And then finally, and again, this was alluded to in the first session, is really, even as we deal with some near-term and very present-day crises, how do we ensure that NATO maintains that technological edge? And that's where we get into this space of investment in emerging technologies. And again, I see a lot of overlap with what's going on in the European Union. And it's just about coordinating these efforts a little bit better to make sure that those limited resources, again, that your state secretary spoke to, are being put in the right direction. I think I'll end there to leave time for my colleagues, but happy to take this into a direction of talking about implications for Northern Europe. I think you guys are set up really well in terms of the national and regional approach you take to supplementing security and defense at this multinational level to be a good partner in the US in articulating all of those things that I mentioned.
Thank you, Rachel. Very good. Next one out is Paul O'Neill. Can you hear me, Paul? There you go. So,
thank you.
Yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be joining you this afternoon. As you've already mentioned, I'm going to be offering a perspective from London on the NATO 2030 process. It combines the London view with my own, and I will try to make it clear where the two views diverge, because they do indeed. I'm going to be looking at this over three parts, really. Firstly, just a quick reprise of why NATO is important. A view of from the UK towards NATO, and then focus on the strategic concepts, particularly on two areas, proposals 1 and 2 from the NATO 2030 recommendations, because I think those are absolutely critical, and areas where I think there may be a little bit of risk, in my own view now, potentially about the diffusion of NATO focus. And Rachel's alluded to some of these already. So in terms of NATO relevance, it seems really quite odd that if you were to go back 20 years, then we were operating out of area. That is, the conflicts, the risks weren't within the European continent, but that's clearly not the case today. Not merely with the most obvious example in what's going on around Ukraine at the moment, but peace is also fragile in Nagorno-Karabakh after the 2020 conflict. Tensions are high in the Balkans, and not to mention along the borders of Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus. I think this has really focused the minds of people, and I'm reminded of the NATO First Secretary General, at least 2/3 of his comment about NATO's job was to keep the Russians out and the Americans in. And whilst that may have been challenged even as recently as 5 or so years ago, I don't think anyone is seriously challenging that. Even before the current issue with Ukraine, when there were criticisms of NATO, notably by Presidents Trump and Macron, questioning NATO's relevance, we know that they were strongly rebuffed by most European members who recognized that there is no credible military alternative to NATO, for now at least. And we also see non-NATO countries, Ukraine and Georgia, but also neutral states like Sweden and Finland, having renewed interest either in membership or in closer cooperation with NATO. Meanwhile, we have China's rise, economically and now militarily. And this raises, I think, some interesting concerns about how nations with divergent values to our own will act if their aims are thwarted. And we know that they're getting closer, notably in the context of the North and the Arctic. So what we're seeing is post-Cold War euphoria about peace and harmonious state relationships well and truly over. And the UK and indeed other Western governments are now fallen back on the language of great power competition to frame international relations in the 20th. From a UK perspective, it is a middle power. And what does it mean to be a middle power in the context of great power competition? Well, inevitably, it means working with allies and partners, because that's how you magnify your voice. And despite very obvious tensions in the UK relationship with parts of Europe, UK security interests remain inexorably bound to those of the continental partners. Even the current government, its most recent documents, the Integrated Review published in March 2021, and the subsequent Defence Command paper, describe the UK government's commitment to being the leading European ally within NATO. And this drives both commitments and spending. Even before Ukraine, there were the commitments to enhance forward presence, the use of exercises, and the vast majority of UK forces remain committed to NATO, including the nuclear deterrent and the Queen Elizabeth carriers. Ukraine, arguably, the UK has been the most engaged in providing defensive weapons, training, and increased military forces, both maritime, land, and air, to NATO's eastern flanks. And spending-wise, the comprehensive spending review of 2 years ago provided a generous defence financial settlement, where the UK now contributes 72.7 billion in 2021, which is second only to the United States. Of course, this allows the UK to argue for a seat at NATO's table and the opportunity to shape the alliance. I think the relationship is ideological, but it's also very pragmatic. As I've already mentioned, as a middle power, influence is best exerted when done magnified by others' voices. And quite frankly, the UK needs NATO's collective mass. If we look at the Russian army deployment around Ukraine, it's almost as large as the entire UK regular armed forces combined. So despite the spending settlement, the overall size of military in the UK has reduced, and NATO becomes critical to providing the mass that we believe a deteriorating global situation demands. NATO also provides probably the preeminent multilateral institution for the UK to engage with European partners. The significant overlap of membership between NATO and the EU, 21 countries, offers a collective communication channel to EU members. But that's not to say that it isn't without some challenges. So in terms of NATO 2030, what does that mean from the UK perspective? Well, there's an awful lot of commonality in what NATO has proposed and the way the UK sees things. So the UK officially is very supportive of the strategic concept. That's perhaps unsurprising because the reflection process, the group that was called together by Secretary General Stoltenberg, included Professor John Bew from the UK, who at the same time was also leading number 10 Downing Street's team in writing the UK Integrated Review. So he was essentially saying the same thing twice, and therefore it has resonance within the UK very strongly. As you all know, there were 9 proposals. Many of them, I think, are uncontentious. The idea of improving resilience, preserving the technological edge, boosting training and capacity building, and combating and adapting to climate change are absolutely themes that sit very prominently in the Integrated Review and the Defence Command paper, including a focus now on the use of the British military on what has been called here persistent engagement, but that is about being out and active around the world in training and capacity building. One proposal is proposal number 5, upholding the rules-based international order, is a slightly different emphasis in the UK. The UK fundamentally supports the desire to strengthen relationships with new partners beyond Europe, but it's perhaps more explicit in the context of the rule-based international order. The idea of upholding might imply a sense of preserving the status quo, but the language in the UK talks about shaping the rules-based international order, which I think is perhaps a way of saying that we recognize it is going to change because there are some legitimate challenges to it as well as illegitimate challenges. And what we want to do is be able to be in there and helping shape that change to one that is favorable. And I've mentioned already investing in NATO, which was another proposal where the UK exceeds the NATO 2%. There were quite strong calls in the UK at the time of the Integrated Review to increase to 3%, including by the House of Commons Defence Committee. But I think it's difficult to see that happening immediately in light of challenges to cost of living in the UK and also more money for the NHS. But the Ukrainian developments obviously haven't been factored into that, and that may. But picking up on perhaps the 2 most significant proposals of the strategic concept, and the ones where I think there may be some interesting questions for us to get to. One is deeper political consultation and coordination. That was proposal 1, and I think absolutely rightly so. We're seeing clear differences of view within NATO. There are differences about how to respond to Russian behavior towards Ukraine. I don't think anyone's questioning the need to respond. It's just the detail of it, that there are clear differences. There are tensions among NATO members, France and Turkey in particular. And there are questions about what is the role for European military capability? Should it be developed through the EU or should it be developed with NATO? And it's still a little unclear what European strategic autonomy that the French presidency of the EU has proposed actually means in that context. All of these, though, provide opportunities for President Putin to exploit and neutralize alliance cohesion, but they're not, in my opinion, existential. NATO has seen worse. French withdrawal from the integrated military structure in 1966 and conflict between Turkey and Greece over Cyprus, or tensions between Turkey and Greece over Cyprus in 1974. And arguably, President Putin's behavior today is countering his longer-term interests in fragmenting NATO. I think, though, a critical issue for NATO is to ensure that political decision-making can happen quickly enough to respond to modern crises. And the proposals for Madrid need to include concrete mechanisms for like-minded nations to cooperate case by case, much as Rachel said in her presentation. There's good example here with the 10-member Joint Expeditionary Force that, of course, involves Norway and the United Kingdom, along with 8 other partners. There are opportunities for ad hoc European military cooperation, and indeed for non-NATO members in that as well. And I was a little disappointed that, unlike the US, Canada, and Norway, the UK hasn't partnered with the EU in military mobility under a PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation Arrangement. That implies perhaps some tensions in the UK. I think there's something about improving military decision-making as well, because it's not just the political, it's the military decision-making, because the speed of conflict is much greater. And we used to be very good at it, but perhaps got out of the habit when we went out of area, as the phrase went. And in deterrence and defense, which is my final main point, I think it's absolutely central to the alliance, but there are some dangers in diffusion of focus. China, the UK is facing 2 ways, and with limited mass can't do both. It can't face to China and to Russia. The pivot to the Indo-Pacific, not a tilt, still nevertheless involves some minor change in emphasis. And we need to be careful that NATO doesn't lose its focus on the European threat. Below threshold, I think, and Rachel spoke about this too in the context of hybrid, we need to make sure NATO doesn't try to duplicate what can be provided by other entities. And this is a definitely personal view now. I think a problem for the UK is that in many respects, the EU may be better placed to cope with some hybrid actions within the European theatre than NATO, but that will be, of course, difficult for the current government. I would say, in conclusion, therefore, that NATO is absolutely vital, and there's a cause for optimism about the strategic concept. The concept covers a right issue, but there are challenges, specifically, I think, in relation to deeper political consultation and coordination, and the potential to undermine deterrence and defence through losing focus. We need absolutely to consider dialogue with Russia and China, and as Churchill is claimed to have said, jaw is always better than war. So no matter how difficult our partners may be in those dialogues, then we need to make sure we leave opportunity open for jaw. And I would also just observe that as Secretary General Stoltenberg's time comes to an end, NATO absolutely needs to find the right person to keep a diverse alliance together, politically and militarily, in the face of significant challenges. So in closing, I'd just like to say thank you to the Norwegian Ministry of Defence for the opportunity to work on important and fascinating topics, and the chance to work with some wonderful colleagues who bring fresh perspectives that we all need to hear, because being part of an alliance is about listening as well as speaking. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. That's very good. Next in line is Christian Mölling from Berlin. Christian, there we go. Can see you. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much. Hey, Paul, good to see you, and welcome to everybody. Thanks for having me. And I think I've been there from the start, like Paul, with SNE, and it has been a great journey. So thanks very much for all those who have joined the journey and have made it possible. It was indeed a great opportunity to have a lot of conversations that we wouldn't have had without this program. So there will be something missing. I'm saying this also because I've chosen to give you a little bit of a look, not from Berlin, but into Berlin. So the paper that I've written and that I would have written until January was just about general trends and how NATO should respond to it with its new strategic concept. But then some of you may have noticed that my government had special perceptions and ideas about European security. And I thought it's better to give you and the audience here an insight of where we stand and what is possibly the good thing to do than only talking about what NATO can do and how Germany would behave. Because in fact, the new government is not working on an autopilot. So this is the main starting point. It's not working on an autopilot. It's not on track as you may have expected. That's something one could expect from a new government. The machinery is not settled. So yes, we have filled the political leadership positions in ministries, but some key positions, especially in the MOD, are not filled for the moment. So that's a part of the story. And all these things will affect how Germany can contribute to the NATO 2030 and the NATO strategic concept process. And by that also, hinting to the last point that I will make in my short presentation, also kind of influence itself in terms of shaping its agenda for the next years, because Germany will set out a first-time national security strategy. It has never done before that. So this is something which is upcoming. But given the shakeup of the last weeks, I guess everybody is kind of wondering what is happening in Berlin. So let me turn to Germany and the 2022 Ukraine crisis. You see basically the return of old reflexes. The government has come in with quite great ambitions on security defense policy. If you take a look into the coalition agreement, the coalition agreement is kind of the contract. It's really, I wouldn't say it's kind of a legal contract, it's still a political contract, but it is something that the government performance is measured against by the end of the coalition. So there are quite a lot of ambitions in there, but these have melted down quite quickly over the question, how do we treat Russia, how do we create Ukraine, and what is our position in European security? This meltdown that you all see, I'm not going into these details, I'm just trying to give you a little bit of an explanation of why do we see all these things happening. The one thing is that this government has been rather ill-prepared for an international crisis, which may wonder quite a lot of people. Because the crisis was upcoming. You could have seen, or everybody was, or many observers, not everybody, but many observers were already pointing mid of November towards the build-up and an upcoming escalation with the Russians. This government has not prepared for this situation. It has prepared for many other points on its agenda. There's a big climate point on the agenda. There are other points on the agenda. The corona situation is still an ongoing domestic crisis. But the first kind of crisis that faces the political leadership, including the chancellor, is indeed an international crisis. And one has to omit that the government, and especially the political parties behind the government, haven't made up their mind clearly. So you can basically see the splits within the political parties that are supporting the government basically breaking up and becoming more visible again. And the chancellor has decided to not kind of take leadership in such a situation because he couldn't be sure whether this would possibly break up the coalition already at that point. Because foreign and security policy in Germany is just a difficult thing. So the one result out of that is we are basically going back to objectives in this crisis that Germany has pursued for a long time, which is trying to avoid war at all cost, safeguarding European unity, trying to be a good ally to everybody, and limiting the use of military force and defense exports. All these objectives of immediately you come to the point where you see there's a tension between these things, but it is something that the German government has lived with for quite a while. Not this government, but also other governments, and it may be willing to kind of muddle through these different objectives instead of deciding for one or the other. So next point basically is that Germany struggles to really recognize how the objectives are interconnected and mutually exclusive to a certain extent. The other thing is that even the level of ambition has been high for the next for the new government. The ideas and strategies haven't been there and haven't been tested and kind of haven't become a practice. So Germany is basically resorting to old habits and old practices as we can see it. And this is something where the best way to see this is that Germany still tries to look at the current world as a world that is divided by war and peace. And that tells you quite a lot, because this dichotomy between war and peace is so defining also in the national discourse. And by that, I would argue, disregarding that we are already living in a world of systematic competition, which means there is no longer a peace or a war. There is a lot of ongoing, constant engagement with partners, with adversaries, with different intensity. But this is something which hasn't sunk in, even if the rhetoric of competition is gaining more traction within the national discourse on security. So this basically brings us back to a eternal German question. So it's not the current government. What I'm trying to make clear to you is that this has long threads in European history and in European political developments. Just giving you two examples. I mean, the 2014 Russian incursion into the Ukraine, Germany has not been at the forefront at the beginning. Same is true, and some may also remember that 2011, the intervention of NATO into Libya, where Germany found itself in the camp with Russia and China, and all its allies in NATO in the other camp. So this is something which just is a warning and shows that these things need to be settled first before Germany can make a useful contribution to NATO 2030 and the NATO strategic concept. And I'm just kind of ringing the alarm bell that I'm currently worried, having visited NATO last week, also kind of giving this kind of into the audience that Germany currently, I wouldn't say it's isolated, but it's kind of, it's in a bad situation, and nobody can have an interest in Germany being isolated and being not a constructive part of European security. So this is something where, first of all, this government has to find a way forward, but also possibly with a little bit of the help from its allies in encouraging the government into moving into the right direction. So what is the way how the German government could go forward immediately? As I said at the beginning, there are some interesting lines in the coalition agreement, which is especially on procuring new equipment, especially the DCA aircraft, so the nuclear capable aircrafts, but also other things. Second, so this is something that Germany could do immediately. The Chancellor is flying to Washington next week. This could be part of a package that he is presenting to Biden at that point and say, this is a political commitment I'm going to do. Second is what we could, of course, do, even if we don't want to deliver weapon to Ukraine, we could offer kind of freedom of maneuver to our partners by and to our allies by saying we will go to vamp up our commitment to the EFP and in other areas immediately, and send more forces into NATO soil, and by that freeing and giving more space to breathe for those who want to take more action towards and for Ukraine. This should be doable if there is political will behind it, because we haven't committed all our forces. So this is a doable thing. Plus many other things that could be doable in this direction, but just to give you a taste. The second thing, very importantly, is then looking into the national security strategy, realizing, and there is something where I guess we can take just advantage of our allies. We heard about comprehensive defense or total defense conceptions, but also France and the UK have made their conceptions on competition versus war pretty clear. So there are examples, and this is something that through consultations with our allies in the upfront to our national security strategy could be something that could hopefully be advised or even hammered in to the German playbook for the national security strategy, that the time of war and peace are over, because these conceptions ranging back to the 1970s in our thinking are still holding us up to also see questions of resilience, of society resilience, of all the broad spectrum of what is necessary for security currently, to make this something the German government is willing to practice and not only to preach on to itself and to others. So I hope this was an interesting overview. I'm ready to take your questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. That was very good. Robin, your turn. You're last.
Thank you, Paul, and good day to everyone. Great to see colleagues who have been with the program for such a long time. In his introduction, the State Secretary has already given us an insight into Norway's thinking and priorities regarding the current security situation. In writing our letter from the Norwegian capital, my colleague Johannes Rø and I reflected many of the two questions. First, how can NATO, as an alliance of 30 member states, agree on a strategic concept that is supposed to give guidance in an increasingly complex and volatile and rapidly changing security environment, and amidst a crisis that, as we have heard from previous speakers, presents all allies with a number of difficult choices? In short, is this a good time to write a new concept? And second, to what extent are individual allies able to weigh into the reflection process and to shape the outlook of the final document? How can Norway, a small ally on NATO's northern periphery, make its voice heard? What are Norway's priorities? On the first question, NATO regularly updates its strategic concept. The last concept, as you all know, is from 2010. The situation has changed significantly since then. Other strategic concept documents and military plans had to be updated in the meantime. So in a way, it was about time to, if not overdue, to write a new concept, a new document for the alliance. And it's no secret that many thought it difficult to think about writing a new concept at a time when the primus inter pares in the United States was led by a president who was openly questioning the alliance's relevance. So this made it a bit inopportune to start on this process further, many thought. And questions about NATO's continued relevance were coming not only from the White House, but also from the Elysee Palace in Paris. And yet, these questions, while disruptive, also underline the need to seriously rethink NATO's role as a political alliance. And therefore, the initiative to start a reflection process at the London summit was timely and gathered the necessary momentum and support eventually. So although the current crisis highlights the differences among allies, as Rachel pointed out, the Biden administration's willingness to consult with European allies makes the environment favorable in a way to take this process further now. In a way, the timeframe until the Madrid summit, although we are in the midst of a serious crisis, may even be a window of opportunity to go ahead with such a document. So much has changed since 2010. The double shock of 2014, when Russia illegally annexed Crimea and IS took control of parts of Syria and Iraq, the rise of China, the security implications of climate change, and natural disasters like the pandemic, all make it necessary to rethink and to rewrite the concept. However, not everything has changed, and not everything needs to be reinvented. The core tasks that have been mentioned, agreed upon in 2010, remain valid. Russia and China need to be addressed in different ways today, or in the latter case, for the first time in such a concept. But there's still a basic understanding that dealing with them must happen in balancing deterrence and dialogue, a principle established during the Cold War already. As the alliance is refocusing on deterrence and collective defense, crisis management and the stabilization of NATO's near abroad are still necessary. And neither task can be done without partners, so cooperative security remains key still today. This is why we see the ongoing reflection process and the upcoming negotiations on the wording of the concept as an exercise in balancing consolidation, which leads me to the second question. One might think that smaller allies don't have much leverage when it comes to shaping NATO's strategic thinking. And it's probably true that an ally like Norway most of the time seeks to align themselves with more powerful states instead of pushing forcefully for their priorities or preferences. At the same time, each ally has, of course, a voice and should be able to take the initiative on specific policies when core interests are at stake. Norway, if you remember well, has done so, for example, in 2008, when they reminded allies on the necessity not to neglect collective defense, even at a time when crisis management and missions abroad, first among them Afghanistan, dominated the agenda. The primacy of collective defense remains Norway's key priority. This is clear. Norway wants allies and partners engaged in securing NATO's northern flank. But another priority for Norway is to maintain cohesion and consensus. As a good ally, Norway is likely to continue its contribution to crisis management and to support other allies in their concerns. As work on the new concept enters the negotiation phase, and as the current crisis develops, the new government that has been mentioned and that we heard from the State Secretary might find it necessary to stress certain preferences. Some of them are anchored in Norway's traditional security policy, like balancing deterrence and dialogue with Russia. Others are, let's say, more politically motivated. The government's decision to obtain observer status in the discussions on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has raised eyebrows in NATO, to put it mildly. However, the government is quite clear and has said so, that observing the TPNW discussion does not upset Norway's approval of NATO's nuclear strategy, and that promoting one-sided disarmament is not an option. A smaller ally can also make a contribution in areas where it has, let's say, special competences. As the State Secretary mentioned, a newly established Defense Commission will help the government over the next years to prepare the next long-term plan for defense, Norway's key strategic document. And another commission working in parallel will focus on societal resilience. Already the most recent defense plan was presented simultaneously with a white paper on societal security, and the concept of total defense figured prominently in both documents. In large-scale exercises like Trident Juncture 2018 and Cold Response, the concept was tested, the total defense concept was tested together with allies and partners. And lessons from these exercises and reform processes can also inform NATO debates on resilience, delivering valuable insights on whole-of-government approaches to crisis management, on civil-military cooperation, and on the assessment of national vulnerabilities and preparedness. Norway, in cooperation with the US and other allies, also invests in combating the disruptive impact of bad governance, abuse of power, corruption, and excessive populism that undermines societal resilience from within and make countries more vulnerable to outside interference. These aspects are very much likely to guide the government's stance in discussions on NATO's strategic concept. So to sum up, in the coming months, allies, under the guidance and with the help of the Secretary General and his team, will have to bring the broad reflection process that started in London, with the decision in London, into the shape of a strategic document that provides guidance not only for the short term, but ideally for the next decade ahead. While we don't know yet in detail how the Norwegian government will approach these negotiations and how the evolving security situation will affect its stance, we think that a certain way of thinking is likely. Overall, we think NATO, Norway is happy with the way the alliance has reacted to the double shock of 2014 and supports the ongoing adaptation process that was started with the Wales Summit. At the same time, Norway clearly sees the need for reflection on NATO's political role and for further adaptation in light of the challenges of the rising China and to the security implications of climate change and natural disasters. On some of these issues, among them the West's approach towards China, Norway might find that its thinking is sometimes closer to that of some of its European neighbors than to Washington. In general, however, keeping the United States involved in European security remains the top priority, and a strong and credible NATO is the key instrument to achieve this. Thank you so far, and I look forward to the discussion with you.
Thank you, Robin. That was very good. We'll take a very short break now to on track time-wise. Just to remind you that to ask questions, you have to go to slido.com, slido.com, and enter the number 737-735. And I suggest we just take a very short break, 2 minutes, be back here at 25. And if I could ask the organizers to put on the slide with the Slido and the number until we start again. Okay, thank you. could you unfocus Robin and put the after the break slide on as the big screen, please?
You want all of us to stay on camera, don't you? Yeah.
Yes, please. Okay, I think we'll just start up again. I don't know if you have the Slido page open. We only have 3 questions, so I strongly encourage people to ask more questions. We can spend half an hour discussing the 3 we have, though, because they are pretty big, some of them. But I sort of want to start by saying very, very briefly that the process that has sort of led up to where we are now has in many ways been one that has been dominated by the political side of things until recently, in the sense that the NATO 2030 process started as very much as a sort of result of French President Macron's comment that NATO was brain dead. And then there was a need to do something about the political consultation and the political side of NATO. And until recently, a lot of the key sort of political issues seemed to be sort of going to be the issues that would dominate the debate in spring towards the adoption of the strategic concept. And obviously, one issue that I think all of you have touched on is the issue of China and what role and what wordings China should have in the concept. And that discussion will come. But now, as for obvious reasons, the crisis in Ukraine has taken a lot of the and is taking a lot of the oxygen down at NATO headquarters. So this has come somewhat in the background. But still, I'll sort of based on just those few words, I'll start with the question from Lasse, who was first to ask, which is that will NATO become too stretched if its ambitions are both territorial defense and global reach? And several of you have actually sort of touched on this in your introductions as well. And one can even add that the global reach part has 2 dimensions. One is the sort of cooperative security part, as in having partners around the world and doing sort of as in doing something sensible in the cooperation with them, and then obviously the crisis management part, where NATO takes an active role in managing conflicts, be that in Europe or globally, and obviously the 2 latter ones have a lot in common because ISAF was of course and later the rest of the support mission was of course the big example, but the connection between has been there for a long time, and NATO has been now searching for other ways of connecting with partners that can be a big challenge if the deterrence and defense part dominates as much as it does now. Not so much with Sweden and Finland, perhaps, but partners in the Asia Pacific that might be a bit more challenging. But just to go back to Lasse's question, as in, how should NATO deal with this balancing act of being a regional territorial defense organization at heart and having this global ambition? If I can start with you, Rachel, sort of how would you attack that, and how can NATO find the Allies find a balance here?
Well, that's a great opener. I mean, I think there is currently cautious convergence between the US and Europe that China is a challenge. Now, similar to what Kristen said about, the unity around the Ukraine crisis, just because we agree that it's a challenge doesn't mean we agree that something has to be done about it or what that response needs to be. So I think as the US negotiates with allies and tries to build consensus on what language would be in the strategic concept, that need to balance both the reticence for too great a NATO role at the expense of European security and defense is going to be the trick here. And frankly, when I think about NATO's role in the Indo-Pacific, and again, this is more my personal opinion, the value to the alliance is not in mounting a military response and sending it to the Indo-Pacific at 30. It's more on that rules-based order aspect. So building resilience, helping to work with the UK on establishing export controls for sensitive technologies, thinking through supply chain vulnerabilities. Again, not necessarily core NATO business, but things where there is a security and defense dimension. So I'm of the mind that, we have to tread carefully here to keep European allies and partners on side. The other thing I would say is, the current crisis actually has brought to the forefront some things that I think I, as a more transatlanticist, hadn't necessarily appreciated about China. I was in a session with some Asia experts to try to build this inter-alliance perspective. And they pointed out that the Ukraine crisis actually risks collateral damage to China, because China actually had a pretty cooperative partnership with Ukraine. Even in 2014, they tried to fence it a little bit in terms of the economic sanctions on Russia. They have an interest in kind of having it both ways. And so when Russia sort of, runs out of the gate in this very aggressive way, it puts China on the spot to sort of choose one way or another. And I think that's why you saw the US outreach to China in the current conflict, to just not necessarily have a naive ambition that you're going to get their support, but just to say, hey, we recognize you are also part of the global order and we're willing to have a conversation with you. So even in the US approach, I see a little bit of nuance that gives me reason to believe that we're not going to go, full throttle towards a rebalance to Asia at the expense of Europe. But we have to think about the capabilities, because people on this call have said European capabilities are limited, US capabilities are limited. I mean, the defense budget is actually, despite increases, pretty flat in real terms, and there's limited scope given what we want to do in the Indo-Pacific and what we want to do domestically to pick up a lot more slack. So if we're going to do both end, we have to have this conversation about how to leverage allies and partners.
Excellent, thank you. Turning to you, Christian, the German view on China seems to have been evolving in the last few years. And a lot of the discussion in NATO was triggered in 2019 when you had this big debate about 5G and what NATO should sort of think about, or if NATO should have an opinion about 5G. And still the sort of the emerging and disruptive technology side is an important aspect in NATO. And the Secretary General is pushing very hard as part of NATO 2030. But it's a difficult issue when it comes to China. Could you say a bit more about the German view of China just now?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. It is true. Germany has quite invested into building up the knowledge base on this. There is a whole division in the Foreign Office. It's called Asia Division, but it's essentially about China. The big question, coming back to what I've said at the beginning. Is the political leadership willing to take the knowledge base and take appropriate action out of that? And we currently see that even with the Social Democrats, who have been very outspoken in the last government period, they have put out their own China paper, which has been very, very tough. Currently, we have the impression that the Chancellor's office is not that tough on it because, of course, the Chancellor knows the economic figures and the dependency that Germany currently has to a certain extent. There's not every industry is dependent on China. Some are already flagging that the relationship towards China is getting toxic and we're getting less out of it than we invest in it. but still the big car makers have no plan B to bail out of it. So this is something that will, of course, for those people in political leadership who come from the economic point of view and know that welfare is such an important point, or is at least perceived as such an important point in Germany, I can imagine that we will soften the tone on China a little bit again, which would be not a good sign, I guess, also not for NATO, because there's a lot of things to do, especially on China and Europe. So I guess if we take a look into the 2030 perspective, where will the US and the Europeans be on China geographically, then I definitely think there is a kind of the pivot to Asia is something that will physically take place, and the US will no longer be that present here. And then the question is, what's the gap and how we are going to treat China on European soil? And there's a lot of things that we have to do in terms of dependency, where we blue-eyedly moved into. Now we have to see whether we can get rid of it, especially in the area of technologies, but also in areas of simple infrastructure that we have sold out to Chinese investment companies, and now we basically are allowed to possibly buy back for quite a lot of money. So this is something where I guess we will have quite our challenge to define what exact action to take vis-a-vis China, not in Asia, but especially on the European soil.
Thank you. Paul, turning to you, and I'll tag on here basically the same question as in this balance, Asia Pacific versus Europe. But I'll tag on another question from the audience here, Tord Alpalvik, who asks what kind of actions can be made or can be done to mitigate the chances of Northern European allies becoming less relevant to Washington when the US finally pivots to Asia. And you, in your introduction, you sort of suggested that, or you argued that Britain can't do both, as in it only has a certain number of military capabilities, and they can either be used in the European context or in the Asia Pacific. Basing on us, could you address these two questions, as in this balance, and then what can your Northern European allies do to remain relevant if being in both places isn't an option?
Thank you, Paul. So I think in the first part of the question, I would generally agree with what's been said so far, that Russia and China are not the same. At the moment, the UK, well, sorry, I'll take a step back for a moment. The UK is very much in the US position in the context of China. It's much more explicit in the 2021 reviews than in 2015, which was our previous review. That was very equivocal. One might say it all determines on what to do with China. The 2021 definitely put it in the position of being a country of concern, more of a country of a concern than of an economic opportunity. So I think the UK officially is very much with the United States on this. And we see in the 2021 review a tilt as opposed to a pivot. The tilt is quite small. It's 2 offshore patrol vessels and a littoral response group that have been assigned to the Indo-Pacific. But of course, since then, we've also had the AUKUS deal, which upset France particularly. And if you are going to be engaged in the Indo-Pacific, there's always a danger of mission creep and being sucked in. But the question is China and this is my view now, but is China a military threat that needs to take NATO concern, or is it principally an economic competitor and a challenge to a favourable international rules-based order in which other levers of national power may be relevant? So at the moment, of course, NATO is principally the military, but there are economic. I suspect in an era of competition, there are other levers that we need to be thinking about and not restricting ourselves to the 4 classic DIME elements. But if China is, where it currently sits geographically, less of a military concern to Europe and therefore to NATO, the question is, how do you engage with it? And I think, and this is difficult for somebody from the UK to say, but I think the EU becomes increasingly important in the European response to China, because many of the controls that may shape the relationship with China as an economic powerhouse don't sit within NATO, they sit within the European Union. As I say, that's difficult for the UK government at the moment that was elected on a get Brexit done ticket, but we can't ignore the reality of the European Union as a significant actor in Europe in lots of areas, and increasingly in the military side. But I think our view very much would be echoed by many European countries, which is whatever military developments within the EU need to be compatible with NATO. So I think that's where we are, and that helps mitigate the risks, I think, of the first question. If NATO tries to become everything to everybody, and global and hybrid and multiple facing, then I think it does risk diffusing the limited military capability it has. And as we heard from Rachel, even the United States has limited capabilities when confronting a major actor such as China, who's developing its navy and its army and its air force at quite a considerable rate. So what can we do? To come to the second question, I suppose the strategic concept needs to be very clear about the relationship of the military lever to the other levers available to the member states of NATO, and indeed other member states of like-minded nations, because it is broader than that. I think on the military side, the value for the United States, and this has been expressed previously by our US Secretaries of Defense, is that actually the value becomes in securing the European flank, if I can use that term, quite inappropriately, but if I can use that term, which would then give them the ability to think about their own forces to be more focused on the Indo-Pacific, where, of course, the United States is a Pacific power. So I think that becomes our value. There is a tension in the UK policy here, I think, which is that we identify Russia as the big threat. So it's very much a European kind of threat, but then at the same time, we also have forces being put around in penny packets and distributed around the world. There's talk, for example, in moving army training from Canada over towards our side of the world, which makes absolute sense, but then moving it to Oman doesn't make it particularly accessible to Europe. So I think there's a challenge, and Germany or Poland might have been a better choice in that context. There are questions about the submarine lines, the submarine capabilities and the sea lines of communication. And the traditional things we did in the Cold War, I think there are real opportunities, and particularly with the UK and with Germany and with Norway now all looking to buy P8 or having bought P8. How do we leverage the limited capabilities each individual nation has procured in order to provide a collective response in that context? So I think there's stuff we can do, which is largely about helping burden share in Europe. And in that context, I think President Macron is right. If we want to increase military capability, the challenge is whether you see that as an EU competitive capability or a NATO compatible capability, which does actually contribute to overall defense. I hope that answers both of those questions for you, Paul.
Yes, thank you. Excellent. Most of what you said there is if I don't know if people from the MOD are listening, but here in Norway, that would be very, very popular. A lot of what you said about the northern flank and the maritime aspect of it. But turning to you, Robin, I'm going to pick up a few other questions here. One, Lasse asked, no, sorry, not Lasse, sorry. Paul asked, can increased defense spending and further development of regionalized concepts work as a viable alternative to NATO in the long term? Is this realistic? I.e., as in other sort of regional groupings that can take the place of NATO if need be in the future, but also then tag or sort of combine that with a question from Jørgen, who asked that, do you believe that NATO's presence in Northern Europe will grow stronger in the next 8 years? So I know I'm putting a very difficult combination here, but as in, on the one side, will we see more presence of NATO? And B, is a regional sort of approach an alternative? Well, I would actually sort of attempt to myself to put in a question of my own there in the sense of twisting the last one to say, what role do you see for regional groupings within NATO? Like my namesake Paul talked about Jeff. Do you want to say a few words about that?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think I understand where you and the other questions are heading at, and I mean, we see both regional alliances, regional groupings being more prominent than before. There have always been regional groupings within and outside NATO, completing what we call the Euro-Atlantic security architecture. So a grouping of like-minded countries or of regionally close countries sharing certain interests, pushing for certain initiatives and training together, buying the same capabilities. So we've seen this before, and we've seen this increasingly in recent years, also within NATO and within the EU, because both organizations perhaps in a way have become a bit more flexible also in allowing and integrating these kind of mechanisms, knowing fully well that as they grow, they are getting more slow. They are difficult to bring. It's difficult to bring along 30 allies in the same direction. Sometimes agreeing on things, doing things in a smaller framework is more effective, is more rapid, and so we see both prominence giving to bilateral agreements and what we call minilateral agreements, where smaller groups act together. The Joint Expeditionary Force is one example. The framework nation concept, where Germany led a few countries in cooperating on generating capabilities, is another. Inside the EU, PESCO. So there are these groupings, and there's a reason why they are there, to get kind of the process, speeding up the process, making it easier. Also, there are also some groupings that have the main purpose of aligning strategic thinking, like the French grouped a few countries or invited a few countries to generate more European strategic thinking with their European intervention initiative, and you have the Northern Group, a kind of a subgroup of NATO, where the Nordic countries, not all of them in NATO, together with Germany, the UK, get together to kind of discuss things, particularly to Northern Europe. So we have this, but I wouldn't say that this is neither endangering NATO nor making NATO less relevant. It is a way, in fact, to strengthen kind of cooperation, security cooperation, defense cooperation within NATO. But of course, there's always the question: if you have too many of these groupings and they get too effective, will this make NATO less relevant? But at the same time, we see that countries like Sweden and Finland, while joining these groups, while cooperating, for example, in NORDEFCO with their Nordic partners, at the same time, they're getting closer to NATO. They're getting closer to the US. So they're heading in the same direction. So there's also a way of consolidating. And in this climate of crisis, we see that the pillar of NATO is stronger. So I think we should stop thinking about regional groupings, smaller groupings, and the big pillar of European security architecture like NATO and EU as two different things. They belong together, and they don't contradict each other. So I think, especially in Northern Europe, with Sweden and Finland, as has been mentioned, perhaps not wanting to join NATO, but getting closer to NATO, seeking a closer relationship, in effect strengthens NATO and thus strengthens also cohesion inside the alliance.
Excellent. Question 3 has a sort of specific question to Rachel, which is EU strategic compass and or versus NATO strategic concept. How concerned is Washington on the diverging language on China and Russia in these documents, and over potential overlaps of capabilities between the EU and NATO, and perhaps at the expense of the latter? Now, none of these documents are here, but as in, I guess you understand what he's getting at, as in the language used in an EU context versus the language used in a NATO context on China and Russia. Do you have a view on that?
It's a good question, because it's certainly worth paying attention to. I mean, both of these documents will provide sort of a general direction of travel for these organizations and giving overlapping memberships, it is problematic if there's too much divergence. But I expect that type of coordination is going on behind the scenes. And if I look at existing language on China, even national strategies that underpin a strategic compass are going to diverge slightly. And there have been ways to talk about, not necessarily, I think it helps, for example, that I think, is it the German strategy, Christian, or something recent that actually for the first time, maybe it's the coalition agreement, acknowledges China as a challenge rather than just a cooperative partnership. So I think we're getting there, but there's probably 3 or 4, items if I were drafting these documents that could be red flags where we want to make sure that even if the language is a little bit different, it's at least sort of allows for parallel approaches. And I don't think there'll be many capabilities underpinning either of those documents. I mean, they're more like hooks for relative prioritization and where you would go. So again, it's more about coordination. If we both say we want to be involved in, climate or security implications of climate change, or pushing back on, theft of sensitive technologies, we just have to make sure that we're clear on the roles. And there, I think that, it's unfortunately been delayed, but maybe the delay will allow for a better result. This EU-NATO kind of joint declaration is supposed to, I think, fill in some of those holes and make sure that the two documents are aligned.
Thank you. Christian, do you want to add to that, or?
Paul, may I just add something?
Yes, sure. Paul, first. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Christian.
No, go ahead, Paul.
I think it's inevitable.
First.
Thank you. I think it's inevitable language will differ slightly because the frame of reference from which the two organisations are coming is slightly different. One of which is looking at it through predominantly a military lens. The other may be looking at it through more of an economic lens. And Christian's already highlighted some of the economic dependencies that exist there. So personally, I think there are always dangers when language diverges, but perhaps we shouldn't read too much into that. The challenge, I think, becomes, are we able to have the same purpose behind this? And I think if we can do that, then we can allow the different perspectives to try to manage to that joint purpose together. And in that respect, I don't think there's a huge amount of difference between NATO and the EU, or indeed NATO and many of the member countries who are independent actors as well, even though they're part of NATO in that context. So for me, the challenge is, do we have a shared view of what we're trying to do? And there are concerns about China's human rights record, about its behavior in espionage and others. That doesn't seem to be a matter of difference. The question might be, of the levers I have available to me, then how do we help manage that and ensure that China is an engaged partner in the world in a constructive way, rather than in a destructive way? But I'll pause there and hand over to Christian, with apologies, Christian.
No worries, Paul. Because I think it's a good hint that you have given there. It's I would phrase it this way. I made many attempts to phrase it over the last weeks and months. Look, we have a luxury of 2 security organizations in Europe. Nobody else has that. We should make the best out of it. I'm aware that there is always the temptation in Brussels with the 2 organizations to have a beauty contest. It's about allies and member states to prevent this beauty contest. And there is a serious need of NATO on the European Union. And that is not because, you have to be in love. It's about, you really need it, because if you want to tackle climate, if you want to tackle green military, if you want to tackle emerging technologies, the regulatory and financial power is within the European Union. This is just the reality. I mean, that's how it is. It has that the European Union can offer you beyond the military, the important military power that the US or that NATO can offer. is basically in the institutions. It's sometimes difficult, but I would say NATO just should make use out of it. There's a lot of money you can tap in, and there's a lot of willingness within the European Union and member states to make it possible to link, for example, the NATO planning process on capabilities and the EU planning process on capabilities, which will become relevant in 2023. So please don't miss this one and in 20 years opportunity or 30 years opportunity where we are going to reset the strategic outlook in Europe, in both organizations. This should not happen a different way. It should be compatible. It should be basically give us a better strength than we had before, and we should go out of this better than we had before. And there are good reasons in it. That would have been actually my paper I would have written before.
Great, thank you. Paul mentioned military mobility in his introduction, and that's a good example of how the two organizations can actually work really well together. We're running out of time, but I have a few more questions, and I'll pitch one to Robin, because you're closest to it in a sense, albeit you don't really work on it. There's a question from Ray. In the media, there is a discussion to involve Sweden and Finland as NATO members as an extra buffer towards Russia. Is this realistic? What are the disadvantages and advantages? Now, I don't think Sweden and Finland would sort of appreciate being called extra buffers, but as in the question of Swedish and Finnish membership in NATO, could you briefly comment on that?
Yes, I agree that they probably think they have their own way of dealing with this and don't want to be called a buffer by either Russia or by the West. But we see, I think, over the last weeks, two developments. One that we have seen over the couple of years, as I mentioned, that these two countries are in a way moving closer to the West, feel the need to integrate, and this started in a way with they're becoming members of the European Union. They have become part of the West, and they stop short of making the move to become members of NATO. And this is probably, for the time being, where the movement stops, because none of them has said that they plan to do this. But the other movement we have seen is what the current crisis has triggered, is that both hold up the right to make their own decisions, and this is a crucial output of this crisis, which has been triggered by the threats toward Ukraine and by the documents put forward by Putin or the Russian regime about allowing or not allowing other countries to leave or join their and other spheres of interest. The Swedish and Finnish position is defending their right to do as they want, and I think this has been underlined pretty clearly in a very different way. Sweden in a more public way by putting out forces and marching in the street and saying, "Look, we defend our independence and we are ready to do so." Finland in a more silent way, as they used to, just silently showing the strength and they don't mess with us. But this goes parallel to a process where these two countries have over years become very close to the US, buying US capabilities, integrating also very, very strongly with the Nordic neighbors who are part of NATO, so that Nordic defense cooperation has also become a way of integrating the US in Northern European security. And this, without publicly sending great signals, shows that, well, we are part of a unity here in Northern Europe, and this underlines both our independence, but also our ability to deter any intervention.
Thank you. We are running out of time here, but I sort of try and combine three questions in one very short one, and I'll give that to Rachel, since you sort of worked most actively and directly with NATO. The three questions are, as in Jan asked that, and how can the strategic concept support the ambition of transforming NATO from being reactive to being proactive, interrupting potential aggressive actions? And then a second one is, one of NATO's strengths, this is from Örjan Rogner-Isa, one of NATO's strengths in the crisis with Russia is its defensive concept. So this offensive-defensive sort of balance. And finally, one from Amund Lundeskår, who asks, how should NATO adopt shape operational plans in light of short warning time and likely limited availability of US reinforcement in early phases of conflict? Now, these three are not very easily combined, but just sort of to summarize them, do you see a shift? Can you envision a shift in NATO from the current very defensive posture to a more offensive one, where NATO takes a greater role in sort of dissuading opponents from doing things? Well, the last one from Armin is a bit hard, but as the obvious answer there, I guess, is reaction time and decreasing as an increasing readiness. But basically, this essence of the sort of how offensive do you think NATO will be able to be in face of different kinds of crisis? Difficult, but try.
I'll try. I mean, I think that sounds like an agenda for several years at NATO, but I'll try. I mean, I appreciate this distinction and this suggestion about being more reactive and taking the initiative. I wouldn't quite call it offensive. One of my colleagues at CSIS, who's actually a UK visiting fellow, is about to write a piece on, or has written a piece on, deterrence versus compellence. And so he talks, very eloquently about the difference, and a chief difference being that deterrence sort of relies on the behavior of the adversary and the aggressor, whereas compellence gives, the victim of that aggression a little bit more tools to take the initiative. So I definitely think that is a place where NATO allies need to think more. So not to become more offensive, but what tools do you have in your toolbox to force more difficult choices from the adversary? And again, I think this gets beyond those pure military tools and requires us to be a little bit more sophisticated below the threshold, if that threshold still even exists. I know our Finnish colleagues have a more of a blurred line between those things. And so maybe we can learn a bit more from them as the US goes down this integrated deterrence path. Something that actually helps in getting people's head around this more proactive approach is scenarios and pulling decision makers other than just those who sit in NATO on a day-to-day basis into the thinking. So, saying, foreign minister so-and-so, under this scenario, these would be your responsibilities and these are your options that are on the table, and sort of walking through that so that they can react more quickly. And that does go to the final question about the shape plan. Certainly readiness, as you said, Paul, is absolutely key. And in some ways we're doing well, in other ways we have gaps. More flexible decision-making, which Paul alluded to in his talk. And then authority. So when I was still in the Pentagon, Secretary Mattis was very focused on giving SACEUR some kind of pre-positioning authorities to put forces on readiness. It's happened to an extent, but there's still reticence to be that forward-leaning. But I think those need to come back on the table if we want to take this more proactive approach.
Thank you. We've run out of time. There are some other questions, but I'll have to leave those and for now. So I'll just end by saying thank you very much for your thoughts and for interventions. And I think this has been very stimulating, and I hope the audience thinks the same. And albeit this is the end of the SNAE program, I'm sure we'll meet again in some other format or some other context and have more discussions about important topics in European and North Atlantic security. And with that, I'm supposed to give the word back to Johannes at Litteraturhuset. Are you there?
Thank you so much for excellent moderating, Paul. Since it was my privilege to introduce the seminar, I suppose it's my privilege to close it as well. And I think we've had a great discussion today and a lot to digest. And I think the good thing about this is the final seminar, and I think we got a really good synopsis of what this SNE collaboration has been all about. Christian mentioned that in Europe we have the luxury of having two security organizations, And in the SNEED program, we've had the luxury of having 3 excellent partners. So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you once again for very good cooperation over the years. I suppose that's it. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. A pleasure working with you all.
Same on our side. Bye-bye. See you soon, guys.
See you soon.